So a little bit by way of history, yes, I've worked as an occupational physician. I had the good fortune of being in the very first class of a new medical school in New York City. There was something called the Environmental Sciences Laboratory. It was headed up by a professor who, when I met him as a first-year student in this first year of medical school in 1968, was already known worldwide for his work on asbestos. And that's really what has driven much of my career, but that's not really what I'm going to spend a lot of time talking with you about today. My career has taken me all over the world, but what it comes back to, for those of you that are here training and trying to learn about occupational medicine, I was very fortunate. I learned about it literally as a first-year student. I will venture to say, without asking each one of you, that your training in medical school included almost nothing about occupational and environmental health. I mean, every time I meet an audience, not only in India, but other countries that I visited, even in the United States, people do not get trained in asking about occupational histories or where people live and what exposures they have. You live it all the time. Here in Delhi, you live in a very polluted city, sometimes more, sometimes less, but that means everybody, millions of people living here, living in an environment that isn't always necessarily healthy. So I wish that as physicians, more students got trained, because at the end of the day, I'm sure you had this training as I did, that the most important interaction with a patient is getting an appropriate history. I was told 85% of medicine is getting a history. And in a situation, as I've gotten to learn in India, I spent a lot of time at MAMC. I'm here now and honored to be at this ESI facility, that you see patients so quickly, so rapidly, that the history has to come, and it's your experience that you bring. One of the reasons I chose to be an academic is in America, even 50 years ago, I saw that medicine was going to be looked after by insurance companies and that they were going to dictate how I was going to practice. And I'll give you some examples as we go through, but I have had to sit with somebody for an hour or more just getting a history to get to their disease. You can't do that in most clinical situations. And that is the kind of doctor I wanted to be. I will share a very simple sentence that I learned as a medical student, which probably has been the most profound, that has guided me as a clinician and as a physician in my life. One of my teachers, it was in physical diagnosis class as a second-year student, early on in our career, simply said, treat every patient as if it was your grandmother. And if you bring that attitude every time you have somebody in front of you, that how would you like a valued family member to be treated? That is how you should approach medicine. And the joy that medicine can bring you is learning and sharing, and of course saying the three hardest words for a doctor to say. Do you know what those three words are? I don't know. Every patient, you've got that white coat and the stethoscope, and they think you're a demigod. You have to know everything. And there's no shame in saying to your patient, I don't know. They say, doctor, what's my disease? Well, I don't know. Doctor, why did I get my disease? I don't know, but I'm going to find out. And you owe it to get back to the patient to tell them that. And one of the joys that I have gotten as a clinician, and yes, I come out of occupational medicine, which is part of preventive medicine, which looks at populations of people. That's how we decide that exposure to A causes disease B. Or we think about it as clinicians. If you've got a disease and you've got treatment A and treatment B, you need populations to know, is A better than B or B better than A? That doesn't mean we don't deal with people still one-on-one. And many of you will end up as occupational physicians in settings where you still deal with patients one by one. So I'm going to start by sharing with you some aspects, and mostly it's sharing with you some specific experiences. So we're going to talk a little bit about the occupational and environmental history. Now, I've just been sharing with you, most clinicians, what do? They go into medicine, they hang out their shingle, and they open a practice, and they see patients one by one by one. And, I trained as an internist before I did my occupational medicine training, and that's not the life that I wanted. So I didn't hang out my shingle quite that way. I've actually been an academic physician my whole career. But I've done preventive medicine. So, this one says the doctor specializes in preventive medicine. So if you're already sick, he's not interested. Well, not entirely true, but the whole goal of doing occupational medicine is to first identify that there's a problem, identify disease if you see it, and the third most important step, stop the disease from occurring again in other people in that same setting. So what I'm going to share with you today is a little bit of sort of medical sleuthing. I don't know how many of you are Sherlock Holmes fans. There's always a lot of Sherlock Holmes fans in medical groups. I've read it, several times start to finish, first as a teenager and more recently as a clinician. That's sort of the role model, and occupational problems, along with other problems. We've all had patients that are real conundrums. We just can't figure out what's wrong. But if you approach it as sort of sleuthing through somebody's history, you can usually get to the answer. So it's the Sherlock Holmes model, and Arthur Conan Doyle, you probably know, was a physician. Not terribly skilled, didn't do very well in his practice. He hung out a shingle and had plenty of time to write, and that's how he invented the detective. He also believed in sort of the afterlife, so when he passed away, his wife rented a hall, filled it with people, put an empty chair on the stage, expecting him to show up and sort of visit with the group, which he didn't, at least that night. But he did write, some fascinating tales. This is a gentleman whose name you should know if you're going to be in occupational medicine. This is Bernardino Ramazzini, born in 1633 in a little town in northern Italy called Carpi. It is the international home of an organization called the Collegium Ramazzini, named after him, of which I have the great honor of being one of the fellows. It's limited by its charter to about 180 people around the world. Ramazzini is the father of occupational medicine. In 1700, he wrote a book, De Morbis Artificium, on the diseases of workers. And what was he writing about? He was writing the original description of byssinosis. Wet nurses who ended up with breast infections, ditch diggers who ended up with trench foot, jewelers who did fine work whose eyesight went bad, 100 different exposures. And what he added to medical history taking is one question. And I'm paraphrasing, but he basically wrote, if you think 1700, the only people that had regular medical care were the clergy and the nobility. Most people didn't have medical care, and the word hospital, here we are in a hospital complex. Hospitals were originally a place that you went to die. That's where the word hospice comes from. It's only about the last couple of hundred years that hospitals became a place to get cared for and get better. There's a long history to that. So Ramazzini, and I'm paraphrasing, wrote, "It is incumbent upon the physician caring for the common person to ask of them what they do for a living." He said, you have to ask about people's jobs. There's also a very practical reason. I learned from the professor that her son is engaged in part in psychology. Think about the relationship you have with every patient. You walk in with your white coat and your stethoscope, you're this demigod, you're supposed to know everything. But when you start asking a patient something about their work and their exposures, it doesn't balance it out, but it closes the gap a little bit. And you're recognizing that the patient actually knows some things about themselves that you as the doctor have to learn. And it makes for a much warmer relationship when they can educate you. I mean, patients educate you all the time with their symptoms, but think about the interaction over what they know about their work and their exposures. Okay. You have to go out and examine the workplace. You cannot sit in your office in your white coat with your stethoscope around your neck and think you can do occupational medicine. And I can't tell you, how many workplaces of so many different kinds I've been to, but you have to go out. So I've been to abattoirs where you learn, for example, that you're dealing with difficult situations of slippery things, and you learn about ergonomics, because most of these places were staffed by men traditionally, and so knives had a certain size grip handle, but when women started working there, they need smaller grip handles so that they can work. You have to expand your thinking to the workplace and how people fit with their jobs. Here was a situation I was called in. This thing that I'm lifting is for a sofa bed. It's the mattress that you can pull out and make into a bed out of your sofa. And I got called into this factory because they were having a huge amount of musculoskeletal problems. And you see, we're lifting this up, and I realized that, musculoskeletal problems, you'll learn about it, but it boils down, most things in medicine, if you stop the thing, end up being relatively simple and straightforward. It's the lifting and twisting that causes more musculoskeletal back problems than anything else. And so these workers would be lifting them and then twisting and stacking them 3 and 4 high. And I said, look, you have all this empty space on the factory floor. Don't stack them higher than 2. That solved the problem. I mean, it sometimes is straightforward and simple, but it takes somebody who looks at it through different eyes to see that. I taught at the University of Kentucky, big cold state. You can see I don't quite fit in. This is my first day ever underground. Okay, I'm too clean. I'm sort of hanging out at this was the sort of lunch break at the underground mine. I'm half a mile inside a mountain. Well, this wasn't too bad. It was a 7-foot coal seam. I could stand up. I've also been in 42-inch coal seams, crawling around on my hands and knees. I did it for a few minutes. But can you stop and imagine 8 to 10 hours a day, 6 and 7 days a week, crawling around on your hands and knees, mining coal so we can have electricity? And you get to appreciate what people go through for jobs. You noticed I had a beard then. I haven't had this beard off since, I think, 1974. My mother never liked it, but my wife said it was okay, so it stayed. But I went underground, and on my hip there is a self-rescuer. If there was ever going to be a methane leak, we had 20 seconds, the safety people told me, to take a razor, which they brought along, dry shave, take my beard off, and put the self-rescuer on so I could get enough oxygen to survive for 20 minutes to get out of the methane. Fortunately, I didn't have to. No methane. We were fine that day. And I'm going to talk to you about a place called Gawley Bridge, a little town of 500 people in West Virginia, another big coal mining state. In Gawley Bridge in 1929, they decided to dig a tunnel through Gawley Mountain. And this was my community medicine project as a 4th-year medical student, which was a clinical field for us. And I had a professor who had funds to send me off to do this. Because he wanted me to appreciate some of the history of how disease knowledge developed. So there was a dam put in place. That was the Gawley River. There's the mountain, Gawley Mountain I'm standing on. There's a state park there now. And they dug an 1,800-foot, so what's that, 600-meter tunnel through the base of the mountain, built a hydroelectric plant on the other side to generate 100,000 kilowatts of electricity to be sent 10 miles up the river to a steel mill that they were going to build, which got built, and it was the most polluted air I've ever seen as the mill was turning out black stuff. You had to turn on your headlights to get through as you passed it. It was terrible. So even in America, sometimes we haven't always been good about things. So here's the tunnel from one side. You see the dust in the entranceway. That's like a 1/4 of a mile inside the tunnel already. And I found a man who worked in the tunnel. I'll show you his x-ray in a little bit. He said you couldn't see 20 feet to the next person because of all the dust in there. And the company, because of, like many companies, sometimes wants to save money, So they drilled dry. You're supposed to use water to suppress dust. They were drilling dry. They'd only turn the water on when they heard the inspectors were coming. And so he said there was so much dust. The other phrase, they said, you could track a man for half a mile after they came out of work from the dust that fell off them. And here was the air supply. It was a canvas tube that happens to be collapsed. That's a fan house. It was supposed to blow fresh air in there. Obviously, it didn't happen. This is a man who worked in the tunnel. This picture was taken in 1936. The tunnel was started in 1929. He and his three sons, who were 18, 21, and 23, and the father, all went to work building this tunnel. The three boys all died within 2 years. He died shortly thereafter. Look, he's got a big barrel chest. Look at his hand. You see he had a big hand, but his arms are skinny. He was in his rocking chair, and he died. You can start to figure out where this is going. And there was a doctor who was hired to look after the 400 or so workers working on this tunnel. And when these workers died, like those three young men, and I verified this by looking at the death certificates in the local town hall, the books were there from the 1930s with the death certificates, he listed that they died of tunnelitis. Now, I would venture to say that not one of you in your pathology training or medical training ever heard of this disease, because it's not a disease, but it was written as a death certificate. Tunnelitis. There were, of course, accidents, and there was a lot of tuberculosis still around then, but this was not the disease that we're talking about. This was the gentleman that I found. This is a more classic, chronic appearing chest x-ray. He's obviously got rounded opacities all over. He worked in the tunnel, and then he got a job at the steel mill in the power plant. So he had lots of dust exposure over time. So what is it we're talking about? Obviously, you probably figured out, we're talking about silicosis, drilling through rock. So you have simple silicosis on the top right. You have more complex silicosis at the bottom. You've got TB that follows silicosis like a shadow. That's the old expression, but still holds true. Not so true for other dusts. It's a little strange that it's only TB. There's all kinds of conundrums and things that we don't appreciate that we still don't have scientific answers for, but we're dealing with silicosis. So this was 1929, 1930. Fast forward into my medical career. I'm now in Kentucky, and we see a patient. This gentleman was a 62-year-old white male who, when he was first seen by us, was on a respirator. So that was our introduction. He had stopped smoking 3 years earlier. He was a stoical individual that occasionally complained of shortness of breath. 4 months before we saw him, so this is his history. This is what we eventually got. He had progressive worsening dyspnea. 5 weeks before, he went to his local health department in a rural area of Kentucky. He had a skin test put on. Now here, everybody still gets BCG when you're a baby, I guess. We don't do BCG in the States, so we can use skin tests to see if somebody turns positive that they might have TB. And so his had been said to be negative 12 years earlier. They started him on a 4-drug protocol thinking he had TB with no bacterial evidence. A week before we saw him, he presented to his local hospital where he was short of breath. He was transferred to the military hospital, the Veterans Administration Hospital, which was literally next to the University of Kentucky hospital. We were connected by a tunnel, so we covered the occupational medicine there. He was put on a respirator. Nobody got an appropriate history. They did an open lung biopsy. Okay, you can save people biopsies by getting a history. Just remember that. The biopsy came back, bronchiolitis obliterans. He had fibrotic changes in his lung. And 2 days after we first saw him, he dies. That's not a lot of prevention that we had a chance to do with this man. So what was the history that we got? He had some rounded opacities on his x-ray and mid-lung fields. During World War II, he'd served in the United States Navy, and as soon as we heard, the Navy, there's a lot of asbestos on ships. But the X-ray didn't go with it. Plus, he'd been on a minesweeper, which is a little wooden boat, doesn't have a lot of asbestos, no exposure that was meaningful. But after the war, and for 43 years, he was employed in a cotton yarn plant, mainly in what was called the polishing room, and he had a part-time job working as a bartender. Okay? What did he do in the polishing room? Now, for those of you here that have ever done any sewing, okay, if you use artificial thread, it's slippery and it'll go through, polyester thread will go through polyester, but cotton thread, it gets caught because it's got, but you have to put a coating on it so that it'll slip through the fabric. And his job was to put that coating on. Okay, and what was the coating made of? Tapioca, flour, paraffin, and kaolin. Tapioca, we eat that stuff. It's got protein in it, right? No known lung disease with tapioca. Flour. I've got a daughter who became a professional baker. There's something called baker's asthma. The proteins in flour can cause that problem. But he didn't have an asthma-like picture, and X-ray certainly didn't support that. Paraffin, if you inhale material like that, like candle wax, you get sort of a lipoid kind of pneumonia. That's, again, not his picture. So if you don't know, but I'll tell you what it is, kaolin, or Chinese clay as it's sometimes called, is what makes up ceramics. Your teacups, your bathtub, your toilet fixtures are made out of kaolin. It's a pneumoconiosis-producing dust. And 43 years of mixing and using kaolin gave him, as we diagnosed him, with kaolinosis. When he died, we were fortunate enough to get an autopsy. And I sent the material off to one of my former teachers back at Mount Sinai, who was an electron microscopist, and had him study the tissue. And not surprisingly, it came back loaded with kaolin, but we already had sort of figured that out. I'm also going to urge you not to ever treat patients by the number. Don't care for patients by their number. I mean, there's the old expression, the patient died, but their numbers were perfect. It's not the numbers that matter. But here, 82, 83, 84, FEV1, FVC, we're all fine. All of a sudden, in 87, his numbers aren't so good anymore. And then he repeat it, and it was even worse. So we went to this little company, and who was in charge of safety at this company? Safety and health. Because it was too small to have a doctor or a nurse. It was the most junior executive who got stuck with looking after safety and health. And we said to him, how come you didn't do something when you saw these kinds of numbers? He said, look, I'm not a medical person. We had a company come in to do the bistanosis screening because it was a cotton yarn plant. He said, and they told us until the FEV1 gets below 60, we didn't have to worry. What a horrible way to practice medicine. Because it was clear that whoever was looking at the numbers wasn't seeing them over time. So, don't practice medicine by the numbers. So, here's a man who had kaolin, and I will tell you that cigarettes also have kaolin in them. And so the company where he was working was sued by a lawyer for workers' compensation. Now, I'm going to ask a question. How much for a 62-year-old person who dies from a work-related problem should that life be worth? Now, you're not in America, whatever, but here was a single man, had no wife, he had a girlfriend, he had a dog, no children, no dependents. So, if you get killed at work from your exposures, what should that life be worth in terms of compensation? Any thoughts, any numbers? $1, $1 million, $10 million, whatever number you could come up with. That life, because of his particular circumstances, was worth about $10,000, which is the cost of a funeral. That's all. As somebody once said, if I shoot you and kill you with a gun, that's murder. If it takes 43 years to kill you with your exposure, that's doing business. Don't let people at work get exposed to things that are going to make them sick over time. So, The workers' compensation suit got settled, and then in America we have this sort of unusual system. You sue the supplier of the hazardous materials. And so the company who supplied the kaolin got sued, and they said, he didn't have kaolinosis. Well, we showed them the data. Well, there's kaolin in his lungs, but it was from his cigarette smoking. Well, this was the days before the internet and computers. I had to go to the library, read up on kaolin. Think of it this way. Obviously, this is all microscopic. The kaolin in cigarettes is sand-like in its size compared to what he had in his lungs, which was, by comparison, boulder-like. Huge pieces compared to this fine material. I don't know what, I never heard, and I never had to go to court, so I assume that they ended up settling. All right. So we still, to this day, find people in America and many places in the world being exposed to preventable problems that will cause disease in their lives. So you also have to think about what's the roots of exposure. Inhalation, dermal, ingestion, and a few others. Eye grounds, whatever. So it's really skin and by inhalation that most exposures take place. And this is a very basic principle. It goes back to 1543, a fellow named Paracelsus. He was the first sort of industrial hygiene person. And he basically wrote, a toxicologist, he wrote, the dose makes the poison. There's some things that are extraordinarily poisonous. Like what? Like botulinum toxin. 100 molecules will give you a clinical case of botulinism. Water is very non-toxic unless you put it in the wrong place. If you, instead of swallowing it, you put it in somebody's lung, you drown, but it's not very toxic in and of itself. Stuff in there maybe. So you got to remember, as the dose goes up, the likelihood of some biological response goes up. That's the basic dose-response relationship that applies, not only to workplace exposures, but flu season. Somebody coughs on you once, maybe you get the flu. They cough on you 5 times, more likely. All right. The other two concepts you have to understand are duration of exposure. How long did the exposure last? And duration from onset. The other word for that is latency. When does the disease occur? So in terms of latency, if you're in a plant, in a chemical plant, and a valve breaks and you get exposed to ammonia gas, you're going to feel it in your lungs literally within seconds. Immediate effect. If I ask you to go out and do some welding on galvanized steel, what's galvanized steel? It's what's used to make automobiles. It's steel that's been coated with a zinc coating to keep it from rusting. The trouble is when you weld on galvanized steel, it aerosolizes the zinc. You feel fine at work, you go home, and that night you feel like you're coming down with the flu. You got fever, you're shaking chills, you go to bed, you wake up the next morning, you feel fine. You go back to work, and it happens again. Why? Because young welders don't know about the problem of galvanized steel and weld on. You talk to an old welder, and you say, do you ever weld on galvanized? He says, oh no, he says, that stuff will make you sick. We make the young guys do it. Again, that's your job to not let that happen. Lead poisoning takes months. Cancers take years, usually decades to occur. Occupational cancers start causing disease after 10 years, 20 years, but peak at 30 and 40 years. And there's even gestational and generational problems. DES, diethylstilbestrol, a drug we no longer really use. In the 1950s, it was given to women to help them with difficult pregnancies. Didn't really work, but when they did become pregnant, and if they were given DES, their daughters in their teens and early 20s would come down with vaginal cancers. The boys would be born with hypospadias. So some things even cross generations. The physical examination in occupational medicine is no different than any other physical, as is doing laboratory testing. It only adds to the assurance of your history-made diagnosis. If you think somebody's got lung disease due to something, you listen to their lungs, they may have crepitations, whatever. You're verifying that that's what the problem is. Over the years, dermatitis has been the number one cause of lost time in industry. That's not really true anymore. It's usually now musculoskeletal problems, a lot of occupational skin diseases. Here's a patient that showed up with these blue lines in his nail beds. You might think lead gives you blue lines. It's really blue gum lines. But this was a more accurate depiction of one of his fellow workers. This is a man who worked in a X-ray reclamation department. Now everything's digital. In the old days, X-ray films were silver salts. Silver was valuable. So old X-rays, instead of simply being discarded, they would take off and reprocess the silver. And this is a case of argyria, or silver poisoning. Fortunately, it's not very toxic, but the guy scares the heck out of you if you meet him on a dark night in an alley somewhere. He sort of glows in the dark. This is a 58-year-old gentleman. If you look above his eyebrows and you look on his malar areas, on his cheeks, he's got comedones, blackheads. He's had them since he was 18. It's not uncommon for teenagers to have skin problems and to have blackheads, but he had it from the age of 18 till we saw him about 40 years later. Why did he still have it? Because at the age of 18, when a factory blew up that was making chemicals, he got a job cleaning up the factory, and that factory was making halogenated hydrocarbons. He was exposed to chlorinated hydrocarbons. He developed this as a case of chloracne. And in fact, we verified that he still had elevated levels 40 years later because we did fat biopsies from his buttocks along with other workers like him. And he still had elevated levels. So his body was pumping out chlorinated material, keeping him with his blackheads. These were a group of roofers putting blacktop, down on their roof. We were studying this group. Again, this is why you need populations. And these guys, not surprisingly, they get skin cancers. They're working outdoors. They're working with carcinogenic materials. But workers, we were noticing the strange fact that there were many car accidents of these workers driving home, much more than ever driving to work. So was there something about the workplace that was giving them a higher risk driving home? And it came from working at the edge of the roof. You didn't want to use this mop technique and have hot tar drip down the side of the building and hit people and cover the sidewalks. So on the edge of the building, they would use granulated asphalt, not hot asphalt like this, and then they would pour chlorinated solvent over it, work their way around the edge of the building, but they were becoming inebriated to the solvent, and they were getting in their cars and driving home. So you have to think in different ways when you're sorting out what's wrong with people. Parkinson's is a disease, of older age, and people are not quite clear why people get it. There's some new data that maybe pesticides do it. But when I have a 30-year-old man who walks into my office, and he shuffles in, and he can hardly speak because he has aphonia, and his wife has divorced him because he's now impotent, and he's sitting there with tremors, and you ask him, what kind of work do you do? He says, I've been a welder. He happened to be welding on these steel structures that sit out in the Gulf of Mexico where they were doing oil drilling, and he would go inside these tubes and weld the steel parts together in very enclosed spaces, and what you don't know, but you're learning, and again, whatever job you end up taking, you need to learn the ins and outs of everything at that workplace. Welding rods have manganese in them. 4% manganese. He developed manganism, which looks like early Parkinsonism. So it's manganese in welders. I've done a study on welders in China where we showed this. I mean, it was in the literature, but wherever there are welders, this turns out to be a problem. Childhood illnesses and environmental exposures. It's not just workplaces. The chemicals that are at the factory that you may work with don't stop at the factory gate. They go home on the worker, in the worker, and they don't stop at the factory gate. They blow out into the community. So, at a hospital in New York City, for years they had not a single case of lead poisoning. And then all of a sudden, one year, they had 50 cases of lead poisoning in the pediatric population. So people say, well, what happened? So people have said, well, maybe they put a lead factory in the area. No new factories. Maybe there was some problem with the water supply. No, nothing new and different. What was different was a new doctor. The pediatricians who had been there for years and decades never bothered to check about lead poisoning. This new doctor had trained elsewhere. He learned about lead poisoning. He started checking his patients, and he alone found 50 cases of lead poisoning simply because he thought about it and did it. And I want each one of you to go out there and be that physician who thinks about it and checks on it and keeps those patients from being exposed to something that may be out there that people haven't otherwise yet thought about. Interesting case of arsenic poisoning. I get a call one day, general practitioner in a local rural area, and he says, I have a man with arsenic poisoning. I said, oh, that's interesting. And I said, where did he get it? He says, I don't know. That's why I'm sending him to you. Will you see the patient? And I said, sure. And I asked him one question. I asked the doctor, what did this man do for a living? And he says, well, I don't really know. He says, I think he worked in a gasoline station or something. So it was actually a 7-Eleven store. I don't know if you have a little convenience store on the corner. Now, I did know from another study that people who worked around batteries, like automotive batteries, we all think of them as lead batteries, right? They all have lead plates in them and sulfuric acid. And when you recharge them, what I was saying is we think of these as lead battery sheets, which they are, but about 2% of them are actually still arsenic. And when you recharge batteries, they give off some fumes. And there was a job history I'd learned about of a man who worked in a big factory where they had a lot of electric-driven vehicles. And every shift they had to change the batteries on these little pieces of equipment that would haul things around the factory. And this group of workers, their only job was reconnecting these batteries and working in a battery room. And there was an excess of lung cancer because arsenic happens to cause lung cancer. But a gas station, nobody does enough battery recharging, so you wouldn't get arsenic poisoning. So, all right, so the man came in to see me, and this is how the history unfolded. This would have been probably in about September one year. He said, this is my history. Now, this took a good hour or more to get through all this. He said, in April, I had blood in my urine. So I went to see my doctor, and they worked me up. They thought I had some kidney stones, and they worked it up, and they couldn't find any kidney stones, and the hematuria stopped. So they sent me home. That was April. In June, he said, I had really bad stomach pains, and they hospitalized me, and they did GI work, and they really couldn't find anything. Excuse me. And they sent me home. And in August, I again had blood in my urine. And I went to see my doctor, but he was on vacation, so his partner, there were two doctors working together, saw him. And he said he was examining me, and he looked at my nails, and he saw a white line in my nails. Mies lines, if you remember. And that indicates heavy metal poisoning. So the doctor sent off a urinalysis, and it came back with enormous levels of arsenic. And that's how they determined that he had arsenic poisoning. All right, so I get this history, but what's the first question I asked this man? No. It was not the first question. The answer was, what do you do for a living? No. Normally you'd be 100% right. My first question to this patient was, how are you getting on with your wife? Now, why did I ask that? Because the previous case of arsenic poisoning, about a year earlier, had been a man who had married a woman whose first husband had died of arsenic poisoning, and he was in the hospital with arsenic poisoning, and the son came in and said, my stepmother is trying to poison my father. So I just had to get that question out. You know, if you have never seen it, there's a movie called Arsenic and Old Lace. It's a comedy, but it's a wonderful story. Arsenic and Old Lace. I'll leave it at that. So he says, I'm getting on fine with my wife. So now I'm getting this history of exposure. So where does a man of 55 with a stocking glove neuropathy, which I've never seen before and I've never seen since, really bad arsenic poison, get arsenic poison? Now it doesn't want to. Oh, let's try this. All right, I'm going to leave this cartoon up for a minute, so you just look at that. All right. So where do you have arsenic? So the first thing I remembered, well, what kind of work do you do? He worked as an assistant manager at a convenience store that had a gas pump. That's how the doctor thought maybe he worked in a garage or whatever. And I said, all right, do you have a problem with rodents? Because we know that rat poison can have arsenic in it. It's what's used to kill rats. I said, you know, did you happen to use any rat poison to kill any rodents? She said, no, we haven't had a problem. Okay, well, there's one idea. I said, what about ceramics? You know, you probably have heard that ceramics can have lead glazes on them, and if you put acidic things in there like orange juice in a lead-lined vessel, it'll leach out the lead, and you can get lead poisoning from that. And I figured, well, if you can get lead, you could probably get arsenic. So I said, have you used any new ceramics? And he said, well, yes. In April, he said, my daughter came to visit me at work, and at Christmas time, she gave me a new coffee cup. And she said, in April, Dad, I gave you the coffee cup at Christmas, and you haven't been using it. You know, why don't you use it? So he said, I started using it. I said, let us have your cup. We took it back to the lab. You know, we tested it. No arsenic. Then it turns out he got a new house out in the country, and he built a deck on the outside of his house, a wooden deck. And outdoor wood is treated either with creosote or with arsenic. Arsenic-treated wood's not allowed anymore in the States, but by then they were still using arsenic-treated wood. So, again, he built the deck, but handling it shouldn't give you, whopping levels. I said, did you have anything left over? He says, yeah, we had some pieces. What'd you do with that? He said, well, we burned it. Oh, so you took it to a fire and burnt it? He says, no, I had one of my kids do it. Well, we know that they checked the wife and the kids, and they didn't have arsenic poisoning. So where would this man get it? And then it came out that on his new house out in the country, he had a very big property, 5 acres. I don't know what that is in hectares, but it's a big space. And he had a riding lawnmower, and he hated weeds. He really didn't like weeds in his lawn. So he used pesticide to kill the weeds. And what kind of pesticide? Arsenic pesticide. And the formula was 4 ounces of pesticide in a 5-gallon tank, and he would ride his riding lawnmower, and he would spray the weeds when he went by. And the only thing that he knew that was exactly 4 ounces was the juice glass that he drank his orange juice out of every morning. And he would go to the shelf, take the glass, fill it with the pesticide, pour it in the 5 gallons, and then put it down, and he'd come back, and sometimes the cup was gone. All right? And if you read the cartoon, it starts out with a bowl which ends up on a shelf that had never gotten cleaned. I actually found this cartoon, some years later, and it really fits the situation. And when did he use the arsenic pesticides on his lawn? In April, and in June, and in August. And a history like that took over an hour to ferret out. Now, unfortunately, his condition wasn't going to get better, but at least we could tell him, buy a 4-ounce, disposable something, or don't use it for anything else. But this is the kind of medical sleuthing you have to go through to figure out what's wrong with somebody. Hobby histories can do it. Okay, people have hobbies that expose them to things. Bird fanciers lung, Budgegar's fever is sometimes called. People who do jewelry work, there's material in certain stones that will expose them. The most interesting case that I actually had myself was a gentleman who worked for the Environmental Protection Agency, an EPA. He was a PhD toxicology type. Worked for the EPA. I had a contract to examine like 50 workers at an EPA work site. And that's the other thing that nobody, I'm sure, ever told you, take a hobby history of your patients. What do they do with their spare time? But I always ask, when you're not working, what else do you do? What do you like to do? I like to cook. I like to read. Except for the occasional burn, I'm not going to have, too much toxic problem. But this was a man whose favorite thing was to go to the gun range and he would do target shooting. I know in India, there was a woman a couple of years ago at the last Olympics. I think she got a silver medal. You have some good sharpshooters here in India. But this was a man who would go off and go to the firing range on a regular basis. And I don't know why I said this, but you sometimes have to think a little expansively. And I said to him, must be expensive shooting all those bullets. And he says, oh, no, Doc. He says, I make them in my basement. Oh? He says, yeah, I have a little pot. I melt the lead. I have molds, and I pour the lead out. And I says, you do have that vented, don't you? And this is a guy with a toxicology degree. He goes out, he traveled all over the States when there was a spill or a train crash, and he'd collect samples and bring them back to the lab. Didn't know enough to put a ventilation system in his basement when he's pouring hot lead. So I asked him a simple question at that point. I said, how have your scores been at the shooting range? Now, why would I ask a question like that? Well, what does lead poisoning give you? A tremor. And again, I wasn't so smart. One of my colleagues had a policeman who was in charge of the police firing range in New York City, who 12 months of the year, 6 months outdoors, 6 months indoors, was around day after day as hundreds of policemen, thousands of them would fire their weapons indoors. And he was a marksman too, and his scores plummeted because he developed a tremor and couldn't shoot. So this guy said, my scores have been okay, so I figured, all right, he's not too badly off. So I pulled the lead level. It was elevated. It was about 50. In those days, the legally allowable limit was 20. Now it's 5. For children, it should be anything at all. It should be 0, but we all have a little bit of lead. So again, you have to understand something about the exposures that different materials do. And again, you're going to work in a situation where you have to know everything about all the materials in that setting. So this was that case. The case of the expensive headache. It doesn't have to take place at work. Young couple. They're about to have their first baby. They don't have a lot of money. So they buy an old crib to redo it for their expected baby. And so the husband on a weekend when he's off from work goes and gets paint stripper and he starts taking the paint off the thing. But he does it on a day when it starts to rain. So he moves the car out of the garage, he moves the crib in there, and then the wind starts blowing the rain in, so he closes the door and he's working with paint stripper. And his wife comes out late in the day. She opens the door and he remembers her saying, oh, it smells terrible in here. But, your nose goes blind to smells after a while. So he comes in and he has dinner. And then he says, I have this terrible headache. It's the worst headache I've ever had. Now, when you hear those words, what do you think? You think of an, intracranial bleed. That's the magic words. You rush them off to the hospital, spinal taps, the whole 9 yards, right? So he says, it's the worst headache I've ever had. They take him to the hospital. He goes to the emergency room. And of course, the neurologist wasn't available right away, the neurology resident. Go sit over there. Here's a couple of Tylenol. Go sit. So 2 hours later, when the neurologist shows up, the headache's gone. But he takes him into the exam room. He doesn't get the history that he should get, but he takes a history, terrible headache, it's gotten better, does a spinal tap, it's normal. He says you need a CAT scan, sends him to the CAT scan machine, it's entirely normal, and he sends him home hours later with a very expensive hospital bill for a young couple that doesn't have a lot of money. Now, why did he get the headache? You have to know that there's something in paint stripper called methylene chloride. You get methemoglobinemia. It replaces the oxygen on the red blood cells. You get oxygen starved relatively. It gives you a terrible headache. It metabolizes, goes away, you feel fine. And the answer was, it was the paint stripper that self-corrected by sitting in the emergency room. But he walked away with a huge hospital bill that he need not have had if he had simply been asked an appropriate exposure history. It's a paint factory. And this came back in a funny way. I get a call. Man says, "Doctor, can I come see you? I'm having trouble at work." I said, "Well, that's what we're here for. Come to our clinic." He came to our occupational medicine clinic. And I said, "Explain to me what you do and what your problems are." He says, "My problems are, I've got tingling in my hands and feet, and that always seems to be there. And then every couple of weeks," he says, "I get shortness of breath. And it lasts for about 2 weeks, and then it goes away. And then it'll come back, and then it goes away." All right, so what do you do? "Well, I work in a paint factory." "All right, well, there's a lot of different kinds of paints." So I said, "Well, what kind of paint do you make?" And he said, "Automobile paint." If you know anything, you probably have painted your house or somebody's painted, there's latex paint and there's oil paint. But automobile paint, it's got to last on that car. And so it's got hardeners in there. It's got things that'll bind to the metal and stuff. So it had this chemical that I thought about, that I thought might be in there. And I said, "Do you happen to know if your paint has isothiocyanates in it?" "Yeah, Doc, it has that isothiol stuff." Well, if you learn about isothiocyanates in your reading, you'll know that 2 to 3% of people that are exposed become allergic to it. And it's manifested by asthma-like symptoms and a flushing of the skin. So that explained his respiratory problems, because he said for 2 weeks we make paint, and then for 2 weeks we can solvents. And then we make 2 weeks of paint, and then we can solvents. That explained that part. Well, what about the tingling? Well, it was the solvents. He said sometimes it got so bad with so much solvent in the air, we'd have to go outside to clean our heads. And he was getting neurologic symptoms for this huge amount of solvent that was in the air. So I called the plant nurse, and I said, "This man can't be exposed anymore. He's become allergic." And she says, yeah. So they sent him home for 2 weeks. He comes back, they put him back at work, he calls me up, I'm sick again. I call her again, and I said, "You don't understand, he can't do this." So they gave him a job in the shipping department. Everything was sealed up. For a year, everything was fine. And then one day, I get a call, he says, "I'm sick again." What'd they do? He says, "Well, somebody didn't show up in the paint department, so they stuck me back there." I said, "Can't do it." Called her again. Meanwhile, the company doctor calls me. It was somebody I knew. The world of occupational medicine, even in a country like America, is pretty small, so I knew the doctor. And he says, "Oh, no, it has nothing to do with work. It had nothing to do with his exposures there." I said, "Oh?" He says, "Yeah, no, he was an older man. He was 42, and he had twins. So he had twin babies at home. And he said he was just reacting to having 2 children at home. That explained all of his symptoms." I said, "I was an older man. I had twins. I didn't have those kind of symptoms. I don't think that's the problem." But he said, "Well, we can agree to disagree." So you got to stand your ground. Anyway, so I took care of that case. And just a few years ago, I get a call from an attorney one day, because I do a lot of work. I'll talk to you about that with my next talk. And he said, "I have a man who's being treated for asthma, and he's not responding to asthma medications. Can you see him?" And I said, "Well, everything's by history." I said, "Let's save him a trip and a big expensive bill. I'll just call him and see what's what." Called the man up. He also worked with paint, and he did paints on outdoor signage. And again, I asked him pretty straightforward, "Has isothiocyanates?" He says, "Yep, it has isothiocyanates in there." And I said, "You've become allergic. You can't be around that." He says, "Oh, good." And I asked him another question. I said, "Do you get flushing of the skin?" He says, "Yeah, Doc. How did you know that?" I says, "Well, that's one of the other signs of isothiocyanate poisoning." "Oh, thank goodness," he said. He says, "There are times when I get this flushing of the skin because of the isothionates, and I come home, and my wife thinks I've been with somebody else." I said, "I'll be happy to give you a doctor's note that it's work, not your behavior, that's causing this." So, we might even have saved a marriage, who knows. But there's a lot, you know, and all of this comes from experience. I've given you the whole story here. We're sort of running out of time, so here was an interesting one. The art dealer was with asthenia. Over the years, I had enough funds and collected a little bit of artwork and had one or two favorite people, one artist in particular that was a dear friend for 40 years till he passed away. And whenever he'd have a show in New York, where I was living at the time, I'd go see his shows. And so I got to know this one particular lady who was his art dealer. And she was explaining to me, she calls me up one day and she says, I just feel tired and weak all the time. I'm just feeling really badly. And she knew I was a doctor and she knew I did occupational medicine. And so I remember seeing her at the clinic and I got the whole history. She said, everything was fine. And then I remember we were in our building where the art gallery was and they came and they sprayed for bugs. And I felt badly afterwards, and I really wasn't getting any better. And so I went home and I took some time off, and I came back and I got worse at work again. So I went to our house in the country, and I lived there for about 4 or 5 months, but I really didn't get any better. In fact, things got worse while I was there. And I said, well, did they do any spraying while you were there? She says, yeah, every spring, because we have a lot of bugs in the country, we have the exterminator come in and spray the drapes and the baseboards and things. And it turned out that both at work and in her country house, they were spraying it with lindane, a particular pesticide, and she was reacting and having symptoms to it. So she was getting it at work, and then she got it at home, and the place she thought was her safe place out in the country was where she actually got more exposure. Now, she had been to her internist, who had sent her to a GI doctor for the GI symptoms, who had sent her to a dermatologist for her skin problems, who had sent her to, I think, a psychiatrist, because they said, you're acting badly. And it could all have been explained by an understanding of what her exposures were. And again, I'm drilling this into you because I want you to think of exposures that most or all other doctors are not going to be thinking about. People self-select out of workplaces. If you go to a cotton yarn plant or a cotton plant where there's bisonosis, you'll almost never find an asthmatic there. Asthma is fairly common in the population and they're in a lot of jobs, but they self-select out because they go to work in a place with a lot of things like cotton dust and they can't work because it triggers their asthma all the time. So people will self-select out of workplaces. This was a particularly fascinating case. We called it the case of cockroach thrombocytopenia. Young lady in her late 20s comes to the emergency room at the hospital with big blotches of bleeding into her skin. Gets admitted to our floor, go in to see her. I was still in my training days, but I was already thinking this way. And you take a look, and all you have to do is look at it, and you figure, ITP, some really serious hematologic issue. And you get really worried because, young person, hard to treat. So I sit down with her and, when did this start? Well, it started last night. And I said, well, has this ever happened before? And I got a very reassuring answer. She says, yeah, it happened to me a few months ago. And then it went away. Well, that already makes it very different because now it's not an acute problem. So the very obvious question is, well, what were you doing a few months ago when this happened and what were you doing last night? We have a lot of bugs in our kitchen, so I took bug spray then and now, and I sprayed all over the kitchen. And that's when this happened. So how do you test somebody for this? So you call in a friend of yours who's a hematology fellow, and we take a tube of blood and we take it back to the laboratory. We're obviously not going to spray her and see what happens. That's not really a good thing to do. But we took her blood, added a little bit of the bug spray, and we just watched the platelets just crinkle up like this. She had some idiopathic reaction to whatever was in the bug spray, and so we called that cockroach thrombocytopenia. Again, just because you have to think about what was going on. There's contaminated consumer products of all kinds. And then you also have to sort out what is and what is not the obvious. Illness after a company lunch. A group of workers got together with some short-term acute exposure. A menu for 20 people. Pork roast, boiled rice, cabbage salad, biscuits, which is bread-like here, and biscuits here are more like cookies, I think, and soft drinks. Very simple meal, all right? And what happened is almost everybody got abdominal cramps, nausea, and diarrhea, but they also got dizziness, sweating, twitching, and vision problems. Well, you sort of immediately think, well, some kind of food poisoning, but what bacterial or food poisoning is going to give you? Sure, the GI symptoms, but not the neurologic stuff. And the symptoms occurred within 15 to 30 minutes and lasted on average about 4 hours and went away. So, 2/3 of an hour to 3 hours. All right. And it lasted 1 to 8 hours. The average was about 4. So this doesn't sound like food poisoning, but as we took the meticulous history that you would do in these kinds of outbreaks, it was people who had eaten the cabbage salad who had gotten the most ill. What was in the cabbage salad? It was raw cabbage, vinegar, and black pepper. 3 ingredients. Well, the cabbage, that doesn't really explain it. Vinegar shouldn't really do it, but the black pepper, maybe there was something funny about that. So we asked about that, and it turned out the lady who had made that contribution to the lunch, she had a relative who had passed away a little bit earlier, and when they were cleaning up, in the trunk of his car, they found a can that said black pepper. So she brought it home, put it in her kitchen, and when she made the cabbage salad up, she used it. But it wasn't black pepper. He was a fish farmer, and it was pesticide. And he was using it to keep the fish pens clean. So she had used a carbamate pesticide, put it into the salad, which explained not only the GI symptoms, but the neurologic symptoms as well. And so we tracked it down to this can of supposedly black pepper, but really carbamate. One patient had a heart rate of 20 beats per 20. You see that, and you got to be careful about pushing atropine because you can actually make things worse under some cases. So here, that was the story. So the pepper from a recently deceased relative, and it contained aldecarbs. So let's finish up here. What are they saying about the lawsuit? It's not going very good. They say working with the fertilizer had nothing to do with his death. Workers' comp, we'll talk about that next. The other thing to appreciate is that the world is globalizing. So we're in a one-world marketplace now, global. We have to work to the same high standards around the world. Well, what about health and safety standards? That depends on which part of the world you work in. So from America, we export hazards. I've been to China, where I've worked on asbestos and asbestos brakes and asbestos textiles. And don't have time for that story, but let's finish up. You have a very rare condition we call good health. Cigarettes and fast food should take care of that fairly quickly, and we'll see you again in 6 months. The $200 for a prescription? Would you like the generic equivalent? Yeah, you're darn right. It's, 1 chicken soup to go. And remember, you should have gone with the half-ounce of prevention program. The Health Maintenance Organization is only authorizing 4 ounces of cure. Prevention is the name of the game. Identify it and prevent it in whatever setting you find yourself in. So thank you for that. And